66 million years ago, in the middle of a warm, shallow sea that no longer exists, there was an island. It was not large, surrounded by water on every side, cut off from the rest of the world. It had been running its own version of evolution for millions of years, quietly, in isolation, producing an ecosystem that followed none of the rules, operating everywhere else on Earth at the same time. The dinosaurs that lived there were wrong, not primitive, wrong. Animals whose relatives elsewhere were among the largest creatures ever to walk this planet had, on this island, become something almost unrecognizable, smaller, stranger, as if the island itself had decided what size they were allowed to be. And into that world, into a forest full of diminished giants, came something that should not have been a ground predator at all. It flew, or it could have. But here on Hatzeg Island, it walked, moving through the trees with a deliberate, unhurried patience, because nothing on this island had ever needed to run from it. It was the largest thing here. It had always been the largest thing here, and it hunted the dinosaurs the way a heron hunts in shallow water. Slowly, inevitably, when the fossils from this place were first examined, scientists did not believe what they were looking at. The animals were too small, the predator was too large, the entire ecosystem implied by the bones contradicted what the age of dinosaurs was supposed to look like. For decades, the evidence was set aside, doubted, explained away. It took a long time, and a story that begins not with a scientist, but with a family in Transylvania, before anyone accepted that this island had been real. But today, we travel back to that vanished island in the middle of ancient seas. Now settle in and let's begin. Long before the mountains of Romania rose into the sky, before Europe existed as a recognizable continent, this part of the planet belonged to water. 70 million years ago, the map of Earth looked fractured and unfinished, its coastlines broken apart into scattered pieces, drifting across a warm prehistoric sea. Where cities, rivers, and forests now spread across Europe, there was once the Tethys, a vast shallow ocean stretching between two ancient worlds, Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. The sea itself was calm more often than violent. Sunlight moved easily through its shallow waters, warming enormous shelves of marine life beneath the surface. Global sea levels during the Late Cretaceous had risen so high that entire continental regions disappeared underwater. Only elevated land remained visible, forming chains of islands scattered across the subtropical expanse. From above, the region would not have resembled modern Europe at all. It would have looked more like a drowned archipelago, dozens of green islands surrounded by glittering blue water, extending toward the horizon in every direction. Among those islands sat Hatzeg. It was large by the standards of its world, covering roughly 80,000 square kilometers, comparable in area to modern Ireland or Hokkaido. Yet isolation defined it completely. Water separated it from every neighboring ecosystem, limiting migration and trapping generations of animals within its boundaries for millions of years. The climate was warm and seasonal. Average temperatures hovered around 25 degrees Celsius across much of the year, with alternating wet and dry periods shaping the rhythm of the landscape. Rainfall remained moderate, under 1,000 millimeters annually, enough to sustain dense vegetation without transforming the island into continuous rainforest. River floodplains cut through broad valleys. Freshwater lakes reflected conifer forests growing along elevated ridges. Ferns and cycads spread thick beneath the trees, while flowering plants slowly expanded across the lowlands, part of a botanical transformation already reshaping ecosystems across the planet. Hațeg sat at roughly 27 degrees north latitude, positioned above what would one day become northern Africa. Yet geographically, it belonged to the European island chain, suspended within the Tethys Sea. Warm ocean currents softened the climate, while isolation protected the island from many of the ecological pressures dominating the larger continental landmasses elsewhere on Earth. For nearly 30 million years, from the Cenomanian stage of the Late Cretaceous until the final days of the Maastrichtian, the island persisted. Entire generations of animals evolved, adapted, and vanished within its enclosed world, while the surrounding seas continued shifting around it. Then the island itself disappeared. The tectonic forces that later raised the Alps and folded the Carpathian Mountains compressed its sediments inward, burying the ancient floodplains beneath layers of stone. What remains now lies in the Hațeg Basin of western Romania, near the town that still carries the island's name. The forests are different. The sea is gone. The animals have been absent for 66 million years. But beneath the hills, inside tilted layers of sedimentary rock, the island still survives in fragments of bone and traces of vanished rivers, waiting quietly beneath the grass. Isolation changes animals slowly at first. A few generations pass unnoticed. Bodies become slightly smaller or slightly larger, adjustments so gradual that no single lifetime would perceive them. But islands keep applying pressure year after year, century after century, until entire ecosystems begin drifting away from the biological patterns of the mainland world. This process became known as Foster's Rule, more commonly called the Island Rule. Across isolated islands throughout Earth's history, large animals repeatedly tend to shrink, while small animals often grow larger. The pattern appears so consistently that it emerges almost like a law of physics, not because evolution plans its outcomes, but because islands impose limits that living things cannot ignore. Food is always finite on islands. Space is finite as well. Mainland ecosystems allow migrations, seasonal expansion, and competition across enormous territories, but islands close those exits. Every animal must survive within fixed boundaries, surrounded by water. In such confined systems, very large bodies become expensive. The biggest individuals consume the most vegetation, require the most territory, and struggle first when drought or food shortages arrive. Over many generations, natural selection begins favoring smaller forms that need less energy to survive. The transformation can become extreme. Ancestors that once towered above forests may gradually compress into animals scarcely larger than cattle. Bones shorten, growth slows earlier in life, metabolism adjusts to scarcity. Eventually, an entirely new body scale emerges, shaped less by ancestry than by the mathematics of survival inside a closed world. Small animals experience the opposite pressure. On continents, tiny creatures survive through caution and concealment because predators surround them constantly. Islands often remove many of those threats. Without large carnivores dominating every niche, small species gain access to food sources and territory that would normally remain inaccessible. Generation by generation, larger bodies become advantageous. Increased size allows broader diets, greater energy reserves, and control over ecological roles left vacant around them. These changes occur surprisingly quickly in geological terms. Significant size shifts can emerge within hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes even less. Evolution does not require endless spans of time when selective pressure remains intense and uninterrupted. Islands create exactly those conditions, stable isolation combined with permanent limitation. The modern world still carries echoes of this process. On Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene, Dwarf elephants, such as Paleoloxodon falconeri, evolved into adults standing barely 90 centimeters tall at the shoulder. In Indonesia, Komodo dragons expanded into giant apex reptiles after arriving on islands with few competing predators. On islands off West Africa, pygmy hippopotamuses followed the opposite path of reduction, shrinking far below the size of their mainland relatives. Yet, even among those examples, Hatzeg remains extraordinary. The island rule was operating there simultaneously in both directions, with shrinking giants and enlarging predators evolving together within the same enclosed environment. Sauropods compressed into miniature versions of their lineage, while enormous flying reptiles expanded into dominant terrestrial hunters. Multiple evolutionary pressures overlapped at once, reshaping body size, behavior, and ecological structure across the entire island. The result was not merely a smaller version of the dinosaur world elsewhere. Hatzeg became something stranger, an ecosystem assembled from familiar lineages, transformed into unfamiliar proportions, as though evolution had quietly rewritten scale itself inside the boundaries of a single vanished island. The story began not in a laboratory or museum, but in a field on a family estate in Transylvania. In 1895, near the village of Sampetru, a young girl named Alona Nopcsa noticed strange bones emerging from the ground. The land belonged to her family, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, a region of forests, rivers, and isolated valleys folded deep within the Carpathians. She carried the fossils home to her older brother Franz, then 18 years old and studying in Vienna. Something about the bones held him immediately. Franz Nopcsa was not trained as a paleontologist. He had no formal scientific background beyond his university education. Yet within days, he began examining the fossils obsessively, comparing them against scientific literature, sketching fragments, measuring proportions, trying to understand what kind of animals could have left such remains inside the rocks of rural Transylvania. By 1897, still only 20 years old, he had published his first scientific paper on the Hatzeg fossils. The work drew attention quickly, partly because the fossils themselves were unusual, and partly because Nopcsa approached them differently from many scientists of his time. He did not see extinct animals as static skeletons arranged in cabinets. He tried to imagine them alive, moving through real environments shaped by climate, geography, and behavior. Long before paleobiology formally existed, he was already thinking like a modern paleontologist. Outside science, his life unfolded with almost implausible intensity. During the First World War, he worked as a spy for the Austro-Hungarian military. He traveled extensively through Europe on motorcycle expeditions. At one point, he attempted to involve himself in Albanian politics with such seriousness that he proposed himself as a possible king of Albania, supported by a small private militia. His life moved constantly between aristocratic privilege, political instability, scientific research, and personal adventure, but it was the Hatzeg fossils that occupied the center of his attention. As more bones emerged from the basin, Nopcsa noticed a pattern difficult to ignore. Every dinosaur appeared strangely small. The sauropods resembled miniature versions of their gigantic relatives elsewhere in the world. Ornithopods were reduced to sizes smaller than modern cattle. Armored nodosaurs seemed scarcely larger than large dogs. Most scientists dismissed the idea immediately. Dinosaurs were understood as gigantic animals by definition. Small fossils were assumed to belong to juveniles that had died before reaching adulthood. Nopcsa disagreed. He began examining the fusion patterns inside the bones themselves, studying the way growth plates sealed together in mature individuals. Again and again, the fossils showed signs of adulthood, despite their reduced size. Around 1914, he proposed a radical explanation. The Hatzeg dinosaurs had not failed to grow, they had evolved to remain small. Isolation on an island, combined with limited resources, had gradually reshaped entire dinosaur lineages over millions of years. The same biological pressures that produced dwarf elephants and pygmy hippopotamuses on Mediterranean islands had once operated in the late Cretaceous on Hatzeg. The scientific world resisted the theory for decades, yet beneath the skepticism, the fossils remained unchanged inside their stone layers, carrying the quiet evidence that Nopcsa had seen almost immediately. Over time, the idea he defended would become foundational to the science of island biogeography, one of the earliest recognitions that geography itself can redirect the course of evolution. History moved against Franz Nopcsa with the same quiet inevitability that reshapes mountains and coastlines. The world he had grown up inside began dissolving after the First World War, borders shifting across Europe as empires collapsed into fragments. Transylvania, once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was ceded to Romania. The estates his family had held for generations passed out of their control. The castle, the surrounding lands, the structure of aristocratic life that had supported his scientific work, all of it slipped away within a few years. He continued writing through the collapse. Papers still appeared under his name, dense with observations about fossil anatomy, locomotion, and ancient behavior. Yet the stability that had once allowed him to travel, excavate, and publish freely no longer existed. Financial problems deepened steadily. His health deteriorated alongside them. The ambitious young nobleman who had once crossed Europe on motorcycles and imagined himself capable of reshaping Balkan politics became increasingly isolated inside a narrowing life. Even then, his thinking remained decades ahead of the scientific mainstream. While many paleontologists still focused primarily on classification, Nopcsa treated extinct animals as living organisms shaped by environment and behavior. He examined posture, metabolism, movement, feeding habits, and ecological relationships. Fossils, to him, were not simply objects preserved in stone. They were traces of entire biological systems. Modern paleobiology rests heavily on that foundation. The field now studies how ancient animals functioned in life, rather than merely identifying their bones, an approach so standard today that it can seem inseparable from paleontology itself. In Nopcsa's time, however, it was unusual enough to appear eccentric. By the early 1930s, his circumstances had become severe, debt accumulated, illness worsened. In 1933, in Vienna, Franz Nopcsa killed his sleeping companion before taking his own life. He left behind a note describing despair over financial ruin and declining health. He was 56 years old. The scientific vindication he spent his life pursuing arrived too late for him to witness it. Decades later, advances in bone histology would confirm the argument he had defended since the early 20th century. The small dinosaurs of Hatzeg were not juveniles. They were adults shaped by island isolation, exactly as he had proposed. Microscopic analysis of bone tissue eventually revealed the closed growth structures he had inferred long before the technology existed to prove them directly. Back in Transylvania, the place where the story began remained behind in silence. Sakel Castle still stands, though time has altered it almost beyond recognition. The interior has partially collapsed. Swallows nest inside rooms where music once echoed through the halls. Staircases have broken apart into stone and dust. Weather moves freely through empty windows. In recent years, the castle was renamed in Nopcsa's honor, an acknowledgement arriving long after the world that produced him disappeared. The irony settles softly over the ruins. The man once dismissed for his ideas now lends his name to the landscape where those ideas first emerged. And beneath the hills surrounding the old estate, the fossils remain in their folded layers of rock, carrying forward the strange island world he spent his life trying to understand. For decades, the argument remained suspended between certainty and doubt. The fossils from Hatzeg continued accumulating in museums and research collections across Europe, yet the central question surrounding them never fully disappeared. The bones were undeniably small, but small bones alone could not settle the matter. Many paleontologists still believed the animals represented juveniles that had died before reaching maturity. The idea of entire dinosaur species evolving into miniature forms remained difficult for much of the scientific world to accept. The answer eventually emerged from a field Franz Nopcsa never lived to see develop. Bone histology, the microscopic study of internal bone structure, opened an entirely new way of reading fossil remains. Instead of focusing only on outward shape and size, scientists could now examine the biological record preserved inside the tissue itself, layers of growth and remodeling hidden far beneath the fossil surface. Living bone is not static. Throughout an animal's life, it changes continuously, adding new tissue, reorganizing older material, and recording patterns of growth, much like the rings inside a tree trunk. Young animals produce bone rapidly, depositing dense vascular structures filled with active growth channels. As maturity approaches, that process slows. The tissue becomes more compact. Growth lines crowd closer together. Certain microscopic patterns begin appearing only in adults whose bodies have largely stopped increasing in size. Under magnification, age leaves signatures that cannot easily be mistaken. In 2010, a research team led by Cohen Stein published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences focused on Magurosaurus dacus, the dwarf titanosaur of Hatzeg. The researchers sampled bones from individuals spanning the full range of known sizes, from the smallest specimens to the largest. Thin sections of fossilized bone were cut, polished, and examined under microscopes capable of revealing structures invisible to the naked eye. What they found settled the debate with unusual clarity. Even the smallest Magurosaurus specimens displayed the microscopic hallmarks of old age. Their growth rates had already slowed dramatically long before death. The outer bone tissue showed tightly packed growth lines associated with skeletal maturity. Internal remodeling had progressed extensively, evidence of bodies that had been alive for many years rather than animals still developing toward larger forms. These were not juveniles waiting to grow enormous. They were fully mature sauropods that had evolved to remain small throughout adulthood. The study uncovered something else as well, something more subtle and perhaps even stranger. The degree of bone remodeling inside Magurosaurus exceeded that seen in almost any other sauropod studied before. The skeletons appeared to have undergone unusually intense restructuring during life, suggesting a compressed biological rhythm compared to their gigantic mainland relatives. Growth accelerated early, then slowed quickly, producing adult bodies on drastically reduced scales within shorter developmental windows. It was as though the island itself had altered the tempo of their lives. 96 years after Nopcsa first proposed his theory, the evidence finally aligned around him. The conclusion arrived quietly through microscope lenses and fossil thin sections rather than dramatic discoveries. Yet inside those microscopic structures lay confirmation that the strange little dinosaurs of Hatzeg had always been exactly what he believed they were. Adults shaped by isolation into forms the wider world once thought impossible. Across most of the late Cretaceous world, Titanosaurs dominated landscapes through sheer scale. Their bodies moved like living terrain, necks sweeping above forests, while feet pressed deep into floodplain mud. In South America, relatives such as Patagodoton maiorum reached lengths of 37 meters and masses approaching 69 tons, among the largest land animals ever known to exist. Entire ecosystems bent around their movement. On Hatzeg, that lineage arrived and became something else. Magurosaurus dacus was still unmistakably a sauropod. It carried the familiar long neck, heavy torso, pillar-like limbs, and elongated tail shared by titanosaurs across the world. Yet adulthood brought it to only about 6 meters in length and under 1 ton in mass, dimensions closer to a large draught horse than to the continental giants from which its ancestry descended. Nearly 98% of the mass characteristic of its closest relatives had disappeared through evolutionary reduction. The proportions must have seemed almost unreal when seen alive. A dinosaur body plan designed for colossal scale, compressed into something compact enough to move quietly through low vegetation. Instead of towering over forests, Magurosaurus fed among shrubs, cycads, and dense plant growth close to the ground. Its neck no longer needed to reach immense heights because the island did not provide the endless resources required to sustain gigantic herbivores. Evolution gradually reshaped the animal into a form the island could support. Fossil evidence suggests the species may also have retained social behaviors inherited from larger sauropod ancestors. Clusters of juvenile remains have been discovered together, indicating that younger animals likely gathered in groups for protection. In life, small herds may have drifted slowly across floodplains and fern clearings, adults surrounding the younger individuals while feeding. The movements would have resembled those of modern grazing mammals, more than the image traditionally associated with gigantic sauropods. Yet the island remained dangerous even at reduced scale. The anatomy of Hatzegopteryx suggests Magurosaurus occupied a central role within the predator's diet. A biomechanical analysis published in 2017 by Darren Naish and Mark Whitten concluded that the enormous pterosaur possessed a skull and neck specifically suited for handling prey within the body size range, represented by Magurosaurus. The broad jaws, reinforced cervical vertebrae, and heavily muscled neck indicate an animal capable of overpowering medium-sized vertebrates through sudden force and sustained grip strength. For a fully grown Magurosaurus, adulthood did not necessarily provide safety. It simply placed the animal within the precise dimensions that Hatzeg's apex predator could most effectively exploit. The deeper pattern becomes clearer when viewed across the entire island ecosystem. Magurosaurus was not the only titanosaur lineage present. Hatzeg also contained Paludidodon, Petrostiton, and Uriash, separate branches of sauropod ancestry that appear to have arrived independently from different parts of the Cretaceous world. Each lineage underwent its own reduction in size after isolation on the island. That repetition matters. It reveals that dwarfism on Hatzeg was not an isolated curiosity tied to one unusual species. The island itself exerted the pressure repeatedly, shaping unrelated titanosaurs toward the same outcome generation after generation. The process behaved almost like gravity, invisible yet constant, steadily pulling giant bodies downward into smaller forms better suited to survive within the narrow boundaries of a vanished world. The first fragments did not resemble a flying animal at all. When fossil material from Hatzeg began emerging from Maastrichtian age rocks in the early 1990s, the bones appeared too massive, too thick, too structurally strange to belong to any known pterosaur. Some researchers initially suspected they were dealing with the remains of a giant predatory dinosaur. Only later did the anatomy reveal something far more unusual. In 2002, the animal received its formal name, Hatzegopteryx thambema. The name translates roughly as Hatzeg wing, monster of terror, chosen deliberately to reflect both its origin and its extraordinary proportions. Even among giant Hatzegopteryx pterosaurs, the anatomy stood apart immediately. Its wingspan approached 10 meters, comparable to the width of a small Cessna aircraft. When moving across the ground on all four limbs, the animal likely stood between 3.5 and 4 meters tall at the shoulder, high enough to look directly into the upper windows of a modern house. Yet, despite those dimensions, estimates place its body mass at roughly 225 kilograms, astonishingly light for such a large creature. The explanation lay inside the skeleton itself. Pterosaur bones were extensively pneumatized, filled with air spaces that reduced weight while maintaining structural strength. The skull remains among the most unusual ever discovered in a pterosaur. Fragmentary remains indicate a head over 1 meter long and nearly half a meter wide across its broadest point. No other known pterosaur skull approaches that width. The proportions imply enormous jaw musculature capable of generating crushing bite forces, unlike the narrow probing beaks seen in many related species. But the neck is where Hatzegopteryx becomes truly strange. Most giant Hatzegopteryx possessed elongated, lightly built cervical vertebrae suited for delicate feeding strategies. Quetzalcoatlus, for example, appears to have carried a relatively slender and flexible neck adapted for picking prey from the ground with precision. Hatzegopteryx followed an entirely different design philosophy. A cervical vertebra analyzed in the 2017 biomechanical study by Darren Naish and Mark Witten measured approximately 240 millimeters in length, while remaining almost equally broad in diameter. The cortical bone walls reached between 4 and 6 millimeters thick, dramatically more robust than those of other Hatzegopteryx. The resulting structure was short, heavily reinforced, and resistant to twisting stress. Instead of functioning like a lightweight feeding probe, the neck resembled the support column of a terrestrial predator built to withstand violent struggling forces. Every anatomical feature pointed towards strength rather than delicacy. Seen together, the skull and neck form a coherent picture. This was an animal designed not merely to seize small prey, but to overpower substantial vertebrates through leverage and impact. The widened jaws could clamp securely around struggling animals. The reinforced neck could absorb torsion without failing. Even the proportions of the muscle attachment sites suggest repeated exposure to intense mechanical stress during feeding. The first discoverers sensed that abnormality before the species had a name. The fossils carried an unfamiliar logic, as though parts of several predators had been combined into a single skeleton. Yet, all of it belonged to one lineage of flying reptile, reshaped by isolation into something uniquely suited for Hatzeg's strange ecology. Inside the bones, evolution had built not a delicate glider, but a grounded giant capable of carrying the architecture of violence beneath a framework light enough to enter the sky. For many years, scientists struggled to understand how a giant pterosaur could survive on an island where most dinosaurs had become unusually small. A wingspan of 10 meters suggested a creature requiring enormous amounts of energy. Yet Hatzeg lacked the massive prey animals that supported large predators elsewhere in the late Cretaceous world. The proportions seemed mismatched, almost contradictory, as though the island had produced a hunter too large for its own environment. Early explanations attempted to place Hatzegopteryx into familiar ecological roles, already proposed for other Hatzegopteryx pterosaurs. Some researchers imagined skim-feeding behavior similar to modern skimmers, flying low across water surfaces while snapping prey from the shallows. Others pictured delicate probing through mudflats like spoonbills, searching for small aquatic animals. Scavenging also appeared plausible at first glance, especially for an animal capable of traveling long distances across open terrain. But the anatomy resisted each interpretation. The skull was far too broad and heavily built for precise probing. A delicate feeder does not evolve jaws approaching half a meter in width. The cervical vertebrae created additional problems. Skim feeding requires a neck capable of absorbing continuous aerodynamic stress while remaining flexible and lightweight. Hatzegopteryx possessed the opposite arrangement: short, reinforced vertebrae built for stability under compression. Even scavenging failed to fit comfortably. Carrion specialists typically rely on leverage and tearing mechanics, suited for stripping flesh from carcasses. Yet the jaws of Hatzegopteryx appear optimized for seizing and controlling large, struggling prey directly. Gradually, a different image began emerging from the fossil evidence. The 2017 biomechanical study by Darren Naish and Mark Whitten helped establish the modern interpretation now favored by many researchers. Hatzegopteryx was likely a terrestrial stalker, an apex predator spending much of its life on the ground rather than continuously in flight. Its immense size, long limbs, reinforced neck, and massive head all align more naturally with an animal adapted for walking through open vegetation while searching actively for prey. The closest modern comparison may be a stork, though scaled to proportions almost difficult to visualize. A modern stork moves slowly and deliberately, scanning the ground ahead with careful precision before striking with sudden explosive speed. Hatzegopteryx appears to have employed a similar behavioral strategy, advancing through floodplains and forest clearings on all four limbs while using its elevated posture to monitor movement beneath the vegetation. At 3.5 to 4 meters tall at the shoulder, however, the scale changes the entire atmosphere of that behavior. The animal's head alone extended longer than many modern humans are tall. Its movements through the undergrowth would not have resembled flight so much as the passage of some enormous, articulated machine, quiet, measured, and watchful. The reinforced neck becomes especially important once prey was captured. Biomechanical modeling suggests the vertebrae were specifically adapted to resist torsion and compressive stress, precisely the forces produced when a struggling animal twists violently while trapped in a predator's jaws. Hatzegopteryx was not simply striking prey, it was built to maintain control afterward. The estimated prey range fits remarkably well with the animals available on Hatzeg. Juvenile and subadult Magurosaurus, Zalmoxes, and other medium-sized herbivores all fall within the approximate body dimensions the jaws and neck could plausibly manage. The island's strange ecology had shaped predator and prey together, producing a hunting system unlike anything known elsewhere in the age of dinosaurs. At a certain size, flight begins to resist the body attempting it. Wings can enlarge only so far before weight rises faster than the muscles needed to lift it. Every additional kilogram demands disproportionately greater force for takeoff, acceleration, and sustained movement through the air. Somewhere beyond that balance lies a threshold where powered flight becomes mechanically impossible. For much of the 20th century, many researchers suspected giant age-darked pterosaurs had crossed that threshold already. The problem seemed straightforward. Hatzegopteryx possessed the dimensions of a small aircraft while remaining biologically constructed from bone, muscle, and membrane. Critics of active flight argued that such an animal may have managed brief glides from elevated terrain, but little more. Some imagined it permanently grounded, using wings mainly for display or balance while hunting on foot across the island interior. Yet the skeleton itself continued suggesting otherwise. Pterosaur anatomy followed a structural strategy very different from that of birds. Their forelimbs were extraordinarily powerful relative to body size, especially around the shoulder girdle and upper arm. The wing membrane stretched outward from an elongated fourth finger, creating a broad aerodynamic surface, without requiring the dense, feathered musculature seen in avian flight. Internally, many bones were pneumatized, containing extensive air spaces that reduced mass while preserving rigidity. The leading modern explanation, developed extensively by biomechanist Michael Habib and others, proposes that giant pterosaurs launched using a quadrupedal vaulting motion. Instead of relying primarily on the hind limbs like birds, the animal would crouch low before explosively extending both the forelimbs and hind limbs together. The motion resembled a combination of a leap and a pole vault, converting the tremendous strength of the arms directly into upward acceleration. Under this model, the forelimbs become the key to solving the flight problem. Pterosaur arm bones were proportionally stronger than those of most birds, capable of generating remarkable launch forces over extremely short intervals. Even giant individuals may have been able to achieve takeoff rapidly, entering the air before gravity fully overcame momentum. Once airborne, the physics shifted in the animal's favor. The broad wing membranes generated substantial lift at relatively low speeds. Hollow skeletal structures reduced energetic cost during gliding. Warm atmospheric conditions above the late Cretaceous seas likely produced strong thermal updrafts rising from heated coastlines and floodplains. By circling within those columns of warm air, a giant pterosaur could gain altitude with minimal muscular effort, much like modern vultures and condors soaring above continental thermals. Even so, Hatzegopteryx was probably not a continuous aerial hunter in the style of modern seabirds or raptors. Nearly every aspect of its anatomy points toward an animal more comfortable walking than pursuing prey through prolonged flight. Its immense skull, reinforced neck, and terrestrial limb proportions suggest a predator adapted primarily for ground movement, using flight selectively rather than constantly. That selective flight may have provided enormous ecological advantages. From above, the animal could survey vast stretches of the island within minutes, locating grazing herds, carcasses, river corridors, and open clearings impossible to monitor from ground level alone. Short flights between feeding territories would have allowed rapid movement across terrain while conserving energy compared to long terrestrial patrols. The result was a predator occupying two worlds simultaneously. It could walk through vegetation with the patience of a stalking terrestrial hunter, then rise above the island entirely when distance or opportunity demanded it. No other predator on Hatzeg combined those abilities within a single body. The fossil emerged from flood-deposited sediments in the Sebesh Formation, buried so rapidly that much of the skeleton remained articulated when discovered. In 2009, Romanian geologist Matthias Vremer uncovered the remains during fieldwork in western Romania. What lay inside the rock did not resemble any predator previously known from the dinosaur world of Europe. The animal was formally described a year later through collaboration between researchers from the University of Bucharest and the American Museum of Natural History, and it immediately became one of the strangest dromaeosaurids ever identified. Its name carried an old local resonance. Balor came from an archaic Romanian word associated with dragons of folklore, creatures heavy-bodied and dangerous rather than elegant or serpentine. Bondoc, translated roughly as stocky. Together, the name formed stocky dragon, a surprisingly accurate summary of the skeleton itself. Balor Bondoc belonged to the dromaeosaurids, the group that included Velociraptor and other feathered predatory dinosaurs, famous for their recurved claws and agile hunting strategies. Most members of that family shared a recognizable body plan. They were relatively slender animals with elongated lower legs, grasping forelimbs, and one enlarged sickle-shaped claw positioned on the second toe of each foot. That claw, held elevated while walking, became the defining weapon associated with the group. Balar departed from that pattern almost immediately. Instead of a single enlarged killing claw, it possessed two hyperextensible sickle claws on each foot, one on the first toe and another on the second. No other confirmed dromaeosaurid displays that arrangement. The anatomy created a hind limb that looked less specialized for rapid pursuit and more adapted for delivering concentrated striking force. Other parts of the skeleton reinforced the same impression. The legs were shorter and more heavily muscled than those of most close relatives. Certain ankle bones had fused together, increasing rigidity through the lower limb. The hands were reduced as well, retaining only two functional fingers rather than the typical three seen in most dromaeosaurs. Even at the level of skeletal architecture, the animal appeared compressed and reinforced. At roughly 1.8 to 2 meters in length, Balor was not especially large. Its body occupied a size range somewhere between a large turkey and a small velociraptor. Yet, its proportions suggested an entirely different style of movement. Instead of the narrow-built frame associated with fast pursuit predators, Balor resembled a compact terrestrial ambush hunter, balanced around explosive hind limb power rather than sustained speed. Biomechanically, the double claws may have functioned as gripping and slashing weapons delivered through powerful kicks. The pelvis and leg musculature imply forceful downward strikes capable of pinning or disemboweling prey at close range. Forelimb restraint seems to have become less important, while the hind limbs assumed a more dominant offensive role. Within the Hatzeg ecosystem, Balor probably occupied the role of primary mid-sized ground predator beneath Hatzegopteryx. It likely hunted zalmoxes, small reptiles, mammals, and perhaps juvenile dwarf sauropods vulnerable during early life stages. The island had reshaped carnivores as thoroughly as herbivores, producing predators adapted not for continental competition, but for the enclosed logic of Hatzeg itself. The preservation of the holotype specimen reflects that world as well. Evidence suggests sudden burial during a monsoonal flood, sediment arriving rapidly enough to seal much of the skeleton before scavengers or decomposition could scatter the bones. For 70 million years, the animal remained suspended inside that ancient floodplain deposit, its unusual anatomy waiting quietly beneath the stone. The shrinking did not stop with the sauropods. Across Hatzeg Island, entirely separate groups of herbivorous dinosaurs began drifting toward smaller body sizes, as though the island itself were exerting the same invisible pressure on every large animal that arrived. The pattern repeated again and again across unrelated lineages, each responding independently to the same confined world of limited vegetation, limited territory, and long isolation. Among the most common herbivores was zalmoxes, a rhabdodontid ornithopod that moved primarily on two legs. Adults measured roughly between 2.5 and 3 meters in length, modest dimensions for a dinosaur lineage whose mainland relatives reached substantially larger sizes. The animal took its name from Zalmoxis, a deity associated with the ancient Dacian peoples who would inhabit the same region millions of years later. Zalmoxes likely spent much of its life moving through dense low vegetation along river margins and open fern clearings. Its skull and teeth suggest a diet focused on tough ground level plants, cycads, and early flowering vegetation spreading through the island lowlands. Compared to giant mainland herbivores, its body proportions appear restrained and economical, an animal shaped less by abundance than by continual energetic compromise. Telmatosaurus transylvanicus reveals a similar story unfolding along a different evolutionary path. It belonged to the hadrosauroids, relatives of the duck-billed dinosaurs that dominated many northern continental ecosystems during the late Cretaceous. Mainland hadrosaurs often became enormous herd animals with elongated skulls and highly specialized chewing systems. Telmatosaurus remained comparatively small and anatomically conservative, preserving skeletal traits that its relatives elsewhere had already evolved beyond. Isolation had altered not only its size, but the tempo of its evolution itself. In many ways, Telmatosaurus resembled an older version of hadrosaur anatomy, preserved beyond its expected time, as though the island had slowed evolutionary turnover while simultaneously compressing body scale. Resource limitation may have reduced selective pressure for gigantism and specialized grazing adaptations, allowing ancestral features to persist across millions of years within the enclosed ecosystem. Even the heavily armored dinosaurs followed the same trajectory. Struthiosaurus, a notosaurid ankylosaur protected by bony armor plates, survived on Hatzeg in reduced form long after related notosaurids disappeared from many parts of Europe. Compared with mainland armored dinosaurs, it remained relatively compact, another large-bodied lineage gradually compressed by island conditions. Its continued survival within the archipelago suggests the island acted not only as a pressure chamber, but also as a refuge insulated from broader continental ecological turnover. Taken together, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Titanosaurs, ornithopods, hadrosauroids, and ankylosaurs all underwent dwarfism independently after arriving on Hatzeg. These animals shared no immediate ancestry close enough to explain the changes through inheritance alone. The common factor was the island itself. That consistency carries an important implication about evolution. Popular imagination often treats evolution as chaotic and unpredictable, producing outcomes through pure accident. Hatzeg suggests something quieter and more systematic. When large vertebrates become isolated within a restricted environment, similar pressures repeatedly generate similar biological responses. Size contracts, metabolism economizes, bodies reorganize around scarcity. Over millions of years, unrelated animals began converging toward the same solution, not because they intended to, but because the island permitted very few alternatives. Something was missing from Hatzeg Island. Across the late Cretaceous mainland, apex predator roles were dominated by large theropod dinosaurs. Abelisaurids hunted through southern continents, while advanced dromaeosaurids and other carnivorous lineages occupied northern ecosystems. Nearly everywhere on Earth, large herbivores existed beneath the constant pressure of giant predatory dinosaurs, capable of bringing them down through size, speed, or overwhelming bite force. Yet, within the fossil record of Hatzeg, those predators are absent. Small carnivorous dinosaurs certainly existed on the island. Balor Bondoc occupied an important terrestrial hunting niche, and fragmentary remains hint at additional smaller theropods moving through the ecosystem. But despite more than a century of excavation, No evidence has emerged for the presence of a truly large predatory dinosaur. No multi-ton theropod skeleton, no enormous carnivorous jaws, no giant trackways. The ecological role filled elsewhere by massive land predators appears to have remained empty throughout the island's later history. That absence may explain almost everything that followed. Large theropods required extraordinary amounts of prey biomass to survive. A predator weighing several tons could not persist without abundant populations of large herbivores capable of sustaining continuous caloric demand. On continental landmasses, ecosystems could support such relationships because migration routes, vegetation zones, and prey diversity extended across immense distances. Hatzeg offered no such scale. Its boundaries were fixed by sea, its vegetation finite, its herbivores already shrinking under resource pressure. Under those conditions, colonization itself may have become unlikely. A large theropod reaching the island would have encountered an ecosystem unable to sustain long-term breeding populations. Even if individuals occasionally arrived through temporary land connections or accidental dispersal events, the available prey base may simply have been too small to support persistence across generations. The result was an ecological vacuum unlike anything known elsewhere during the age of dinosaurs. Vacant niches rarely remain empty for long. Evolution continually redistributes opportunity toward whatever organisms happen to possess the necessary adaptations to exploit it. On Hatzeg, the absence of giant terrestrial carnivores opened space for a completely different kind of predator to expand beyond the roles normally occupied by its relatives. Hatzegopteryx entered that vacancy. Most giant, age-darked pterosaurs elsewhere appear to have occupied specialized feeding roles alongside dominant theropod predators. On Hatzeg, no such competitors existed. The giant pterosaur encountered an ecosystem where the highest predatory position remained structurally available. Over time, its anatomy shifted accordingly. The reinforced neck, widened skull, terrestrial stalking behavior, and immense body size all align with an animal adapting not merely to island life, but specifically to the absence of conventional apex predators. The island had effectively conducted a natural evolutionary experiment. Remove the dominant terrestrial carnivore lineage from an isolated ecosystem, restrict available resources, and observe which organism expands to occupy the vacant position. The answer, in this case, was not another dinosaur. It was a flying reptile reshaped into something far more terrestrial and powerful than its mainland relatives. That is what makes Hatzeg scientifically extraordinary. The island does not merely demonstrate dwarfism or ecological isolation. It preserves evidence of a complete predator replacement event where one major class of apex predators disappeared from the system entirely and another inherited the role instead. For millions of years, the top hunter of this enclosed dinosaur world was not a theropod at all, but a giant pterosaur walking silently across the ground beneath its own folded wings. Not every creature on Hatzeg followed the strange biological distortions shaping the island's dinosaurs. Amid the shrinking titanosaurs, compressed ornithopods, and unusually specialized predators, some animals appear to have remained almost unchanged, carrying proportions broadly similar to relatives living elsewhere across the late Cretaceous world. One of the clearest examples was Alotopithecus precedens. This medium-sized crocodiliform inhabited the waterways and floodplain margins of the Hatzeg ecosystem, moving through shallow channels and vegetated riverbanks with a body plan already recognizable in modern crocodilians. Its skull, limb proportions, and overall dimensions show no dramatic evidence of dwarfism or gigantism. Compared with the radical anatomical transformations occurring among the island's dinosaurs, Allodapasuchus appears remarkably stable. That stability is not unique to Hatzeg. Across many island ecosystems, both ancient and modern, crocodilian lineages often resist the size changes predicted by the island rule. While mammals and large active reptiles may shrink rapidly under restricted resources, crocodilians frequently maintain body dimensions close to those of mainland populations, even after prolonged isolation. The reason may lie in metabolism itself. Crocodilians are ectothermic animals, dependent on external environmental heat rather than generating large amounts of internal metabolic energy. Their caloric requirements remain extremely low relative to body mass. A crocodilian can survive long periods with little food, reducing energetic pressure during times of scarcity. Large, warm-blooded animals, by contrast, require continual intake simply to maintain internal physiological function. On an isolated island where resources fluctuate seasonally and total biomass remains limited, that difference becomes profound. For a dinosaur or giant pterosaur, body size carried immense metabolic cost. For a crocodilian resting motionless beside a riverbank, the same ecological constraints imposed far less pressure toward reduction. Other small-bodied animals on Hatzeg reveal similar resistance to dramatic size change. Fossils of turtles, frogs, snakes, lizards, and various amphibians show proportions broadly comparable to mainland relatives from the same time period. Their bodies do not display the severe evolutionary compression seen in the island's large herbivorous dinosaurs. Research led by Michael Benton and colleagues at the University of Bristol helped clarify the pattern further. The island rule operated intensely among Hatzeg's dinosaurs, especially large herbivores and highly active predators, yet many ectothermic groups and smaller vertebrates showed little or no obvious alteration in size. Fish, amphibians, turtles, crocodilians, and several small reptiles appear to have remained within normal ecological ranges despite millions of years of isolation. The implication is important because it reveals the island rule is not a universal law applying equally across all life. Its effects concentrate most strongly among animals with rapid metabolisms and high energetic demands. The more continuously an organism depends on food intake, the more vulnerable it becomes to the restrictive economics of island existence. Hatzeg, therefore, was not simply shrinking everything indiscriminately. The island acted selectively, pressuring certain physiologies far more intensely than others. Warm-blooded animals carrying enormous energetic costs were reshaped generation after generation, while slower metabolizing creatures drifted through the same ecosystem comparatively unchanged. In the rivers beneath the island's forests, Allodapasuchus waded quietly through all of it, a reminder that evolution does not apply pressure evenly. Some bodies bend dramatically beneath environmental constraints. Others remain almost still, while the world around them transforms. Far beyond the boundaries of Hatzeg Island, the late Cretaceous seas were scattered with other isolated worlds. Europe, as it exists today, had not yet assembled into a continuous continent. Instead, warm, shallow waters divided the region into an immense archipelago of islands separated by channels, lagoons, and stretches of open sea. Some islands were large enough to sustain forests and river systems for millions of years. Others rose only briefly above the waterline before subsiding again beneath the Tethys. Each island became its own evolutionary enclosure. Isolation worked differently depending on size, distance, climate, and which animals happened to arrive first. One island might favor shrinking herbivores while another preserved more ancestral forms. Predators, scavengers, and plant life shifted independently from island to island, producing ecosystems connected geographically yet biologically distinct. The entire European archipelago functioned less like a continent and more like a chain of separate evolutionary experiments unfolding simultaneously across the sea. Rabdodon offers one of the clearest examples of that variation. This ornithopod dinosaur appears across several European island localities, yet populations differ noticeably in body size and skeletal proportions depending on where they lived. Some island forms remained comparatively large, while others display reductions consistent with dwarfing pressures. The pattern suggests the island rule was operating widely throughout the archipelago rather than being confined to Hatzeg alone. Another remarkable case emerged from what is now Italy. Tethysodros insularis inhabited an Adriatic island environment during roughly the same general period. Although related to larger hadrosauroid dinosaurs elsewhere, it too exhibited reduced body dimensions shaped by insular conditions. Its fossils preserve an animal streamlined for survival within a restricted ecosystem, reinforcing the growing picture of repeated evolutionary compression across Europe's fragmented islands. The skies above the archipelago may have connected these isolated systems in ways impossible for ground-dwelling animals. Fossils belonging to giant age-darked pterosaurs appear across multiple European Cretaceous localities, suggesting that Hatzegopteryx, or closely related forms, were capable of moving between islands. Flight granted access to ecological opportunities unavailable to purely terrestrial predators. A pterosaur could cross marine barriers, colonize newly isolated landmasses, and establish itself within ecosystems lacking dominant carnivores. That mobility may explain why giant asdarchids appear repeatedly within island environments despite the instability of those habitats over geological time. As coastlines shifted and sea levels fluctuated, flying predators could relocate while many ground animals remained trapped within shrinking territories. Seen together, the European archipelago begins to resemble a vast natural laboratory spread across the Tethys Sea. Each island imposed slightly different constraints, yet the same broad forces appeared repeatedly. Resource limitation altered body size. Isolation reshaped anatomy. Ecological vacancies encouraged unexpected predators to expand into new roles. Entire lineages diverged quietly from mainland relatives over millions of years until their ecosystems became almost unrecognizable. Hatzeg remains the most complete and best preserved window into that lost network of islands, but it was never truly alone. Around it, dozens of parallel worlds were conducting their own experiments in miniature evolution, each separated by warm water and distance, each generating forms of life, subtly or dramatically, unlike those beyond the horizon. Morning on Hatzeg did not arrive with sudden brightness. Light filtered gradually through humid air, spreading in pale layers across the floodplains, while mist lingered low among the ferns. During the wet season, the ground held the smell of soaked vegetation and mineral-rich mud left behind by swollen rivers. In the dry months, dust settled lightly over the undergrowth, and the heat remained suspended beneath the trees long after sunset. Mean annual temperatures hovered near 25 degrees Celsius, though nights could cool unexpectedly once the winds shifted inland from the sea. The island carried the atmosphere of a subtropical world, balanced between abundance and limitation. Dense growth covered much of the low terrain. Ferns spread outward in enormous clusters across the river margins, while horsetails rose from damp soil beside shallow pools and braided streams. Cycads formed thick crowns beneath taller vegetation, their rigid leaves collecting beads of condensation before dawn. Flowering plants had already begun advancing through the understory, introducing patches of softer foliage among older plant lineages that had dominated the earth for millions of years. Farther uphill, where the soil became thinner and drainage improved, conifer forests gathered along elevated ridges above the floodplains. Rivers shaped nearly everything. They divided the landscape into shifting corridors of moisture and shade, carrying sediment across the island during seasonal flooding. Fallen trunks collected along muddy banks. Insects moved constantly through the vegetation, though their sounds likely remained softer than those of many modern tropical forests. Much of Hatzeg's animal life relied on stillness. The island's soundscape lacked something fundamental. No giant theropod calls rolled across the plains. No multi-ton carnivore announced its territory through deep, resonant vocalizations. The absence altered the atmosphere in ways difficult to describe. Instead, quieter noises dominated the environment. The movement of dwarf sauropods through fern clearings produced slow respiratory exhalations and the muted crack of stems beneath rounded feet. Balor passed through dense vegetation with abrupt percussion, quick impacts against branches, and leaf litter before silence returned almost immediately afterward. And then there were the pauses, periods when the island seemed to stop moving entirely. Those silences may have been the clearest sign that Hatzegopteryx was nearby. A terrestrial hunter of that scale would not need constant speed. It could move with deliberate patience through open clearings and forest margins, scanning slowly with its enormous skull held forward above the vegetation. Standing on all fours, the animal reached roughly 3.5 to 4 meters at the shoulder, high enough for its head to drift above cycads and low conifer branches while searching for movement below. What would feel most unsettling to a human observer would not be the size alone, but the distortion of proportion across the ecosystem. Sauropods stood at eye level rather than towering overhead. Armored dinosaurs moved through undergrowth at dimensions smaller than expected. Predators occupied spaces that seemed biologically misplaced. Then, across an open patch of floodplain, a shadow would spread over the ground. A Hatzegopteryx, extending wings nearly 10 meters across, would cast darkness comparable in size to a small bus, the outline passing silently over ferns and shallow water, before folding inward again as the animal settled back onto the earth. No tyrannosaur ever crossed that clearing. No abelosaurid waited beyond the trees. The role belonged instead to a giant creature descended from flying reptiles, walking quietly through the island that had reshaped everything living upon it. Most living things vanish without leaving any trace at all. For a body to survive across tens of millions of years, an unlikely chain of events must occur with near-perfect timing. The animal must die in the right environment. Scavengers must fail to destroy the remains completely. Oxygen exposure must be limited. Sediment must arrive quickly enough to seal the body away before weather and bacteria erase it. Even then, survival is rare. Entire ecosystems can disappear almost without record, leaving behind only scattered fragments buried inside stone. Hatzeg endured because the island repeatedly buried its dead. The floodplains that crossed the basin during the Late Cretaceous shifted constantly with seasonal rainfall. Rivers overflowed their banks and spread thick layers of sediment across low ground, covering carcasses beneath mud and silt before decomposition could fully dismantle them. During stronger flooding events, entire sections of vegetation collapsed into channels together, carrying bones, branches, and mineral-rich debris into temporary burial sites. Volcanic activity elsewhere in the surrounding region also altered groundwater chemistry, saturating buried material with dissolved minerals that slowly replaced organic structures inside the bones themselves. Over immense stretches of time, flesh vanished but stone remembered the shape. More than a century of excavation has produced hundreds of individual specimens from the Hatzeg Basin. Most belong to the island's herbivores. The dwarf titanosaurs and smaller plant-eating dinosaurs existed in greater numbers across the ecosystem, so statistically, they left behind more remains. Their bones appear in floodplain sediments, river deposits, and eroded hillsides throughout the region. Predator fossils remain much rarer, following the same ecological patterns seen in modern ecosystems where carnivores always exist in lower population densities than the animals they hunt. Even the most famous predators survive only in fragments. The holotype specimen of Hatzegopteryx consists primarily of portions of the skull and a humerus, yet those incomplete remains proved enough to reveal an animal unlike any other known pterosaur. The proportions of the skull fragments indicated extraordinary width and muscular power, while the preserved neck vertebra dimensions exposed the unusual robustness that transformed scientific understanding of how the animal lived and hunted. Balor Bondoc endured more completely. Roughly 75% of the skeleton survived rapid burial during a monsoonal flood event approximately 70 million years ago. Vertebrae, pelvis, hind limbs, and shoulder elements remained articulated closely enough for paleontologists to reconstruct the animal's strange anatomy with unusual confidence. Without that sudden burial, the stocky predator might have disappeared from history entirely. Yet the missing pieces still outnumber everything recovered. Soft tissue rarely survives, skin impressions remain scarce. Vocalizations, mating behavior, territorial displays, migration patterns, and social bonds dissolve almost immediately after death, leaving no direct fossil evidence behind. Eggs and nests are also elusive, though several titanosaur eggs discovered in the region have been tentatively associated with Magurosaurus. Much of Hatzeg's living world, therefore, exists only through careful inference built from anatomy, sedimentology, biomechanics, and comparison with modern animals. Excavation continues even now. The UNESCO Global Geopark designation, established in 2015, strengthened scientific protection across the basin while new discoveries continue emerging from the surrounding formations. Additional titanosaur species, including Petrosteton and Uriash, were formally described during the 2020s, extending the picture of the island beyond what earlier generations imagined possible. Each fossil changes the ecosystem slightly, not by adding another name to a catalog, but by sharpening the outline of a vanished world that still waits beneath the stone. Bones preserve structure with remarkable precision, yet they remain almost silent about thought. A skeleton can reveal how an animal moved, how quickly it grew, what forces passed through its limbs, even where muscles once attached. But behavior exists in softer territory. Fear, recognition, memory, habit, curiosity, caution, social bonds, learn movement through familiar terrain. All of it vanishes almost immediately after death. The inner lives of Hatzeg's animals, therefore, survive only as shadows cast indirectly through anatomy and comparison with living descendants. Even so, some shadows are clearer than others. Among the island's predators, Balor Bondoc likely possessed one of the most neurologically sophisticated brains found in any non-avian dinosaur. Dromaeosaurids, as a group, exhibited unusually high encephalization quotients, the relationship between brain size and body size, often used as a rough indicator of cognitive complexity. Their values approach those seen in many modern birds, particularly ground hunting species that depend on coordination, visual tracking, and rapid behavioral adjustment. That does not imply human like intelligence, nor anything close to mammalian abstraction, but it does suggest flexibility. A predator moving through dense subtropical vegetation would benefit from recognizing patterns in prey movement, remembering terrain features, and adjusting hunting strategies based on previous success. Balar may have recognized individuals of its own species. It may have learned preferred hunting paths through fern corridors, or developed seasonal familiarity with watering sites where prey gathered during dry periods. Such behaviors are common across modern birds and reptiles, emerging not from complex reasoning but from persistent sensory learning accumulated over time. The island's giant pterosaur reveals a different kind of intelligence. Brain endocasts from related darkid species show enlarged optic lobes and a well-developed cerebellum, structures associated with visual processing and precise motor coordination. An animal capable of both flight and terrestrial stalking required extraordinary control over balance, neck positioning, and spatial awareness. Hatzegopteryx likely depended heavily on vision. Its immense skull, carried high above the vegetation, would have allowed it to monitor movement across wide-open clearings while remaining almost motionless itself. The precision required for flight alone was considerable, launching from uneven ground, adjusting wing position within changing air currents, and landing safely among dense vegetation demanded continuous sensory integration. Yet those same neurological systems also benefited a ground predator that hunted through patience and timing rather than pursuit. Far below that towering hunter, juvenile Magurosaurus may have relied on collective vigilance for survival. Clusters of young individuals found together in the fossil record resemble the grouping behavior seen in many modern prey species. Multiple animals scanning different directions improve the likelihood of detecting danger before an attack begins. Even simple social coordination can dramatically improve survival rates in environments where predators depend on surprise. Island isolation may also have reshaped behavior in subtler ways. Modern island species frequently develop reduced fear responses after long separation from major predators, a pattern known as island tameness. Birds nesting on remote islands often allow dangerous proximity before fleeing. Mammals isolated from large carnivores become slower to react to threat cues over generations. If similar processes occurred on Hatzeg, some prey animals may have become less vigilant than their mainland relatives, especially toward aerial danger emerging silently from above. But certainty ends there. No fossil records hesitation before flight. None preserves parental teaching, territorial conflict, courtship display, or the private rhythms of daily existence. The real behavioral world of Hatzeg vanished long ago, leaving only fragments of anatomy from which cautious imagination can briefly reconstruct the edges of forgotten minds. Long before ecologists placed equations onto paper, islands were already conducting experiments of their own. Every isolated landmass alters life in predictable ways. Distance changes which animals arrive. Limited space changes which survive. Scarcity reshapes bodies, behaviors, and relationships between species until the ecosystem begins to diverge from the continent that produced it. Across enough generations, the island stops resembling a fragment of the mainland and becomes a biological system operating under entirely different conditions. In 1967, Ecologists Edward Osborne Wilson and Robert MacArthur formalized this idea in the theory of island biogeography. Their central insight was elegantly simple. The number of species on an island does not remain fixed, but settles into a shifting equilibrium between two opposing processes. Immigration introduces new organisms from elsewhere, while extinction removes existing populations unable to sustain themselves. The balance between those forces depends largely on two variables: island size and isolation from the mainland. Large islands generally support more species because they contain more habitats and resources. Nearby islands receive more immigrants because colonization is easier. Small, remote islands lose species more quickly and gain new ones less often. The result is a constantly adjusting ecological balance shaped by geography itself. Hatzeg preserves those principles inside stone. The fossil record reveals repeated colonization events spread across millions of years. Four distinct titanosaur lineages reached the island independently from different regions of the late Cretaceous world. Once isolated there, each lineage underwent its own separate process of dwarfism. The pattern repeated so consistently that coincidence becomes impossible. Geography imposed the same selective pressures over and over again, producing similar evolutionary outcomes from unrelated starting points. Extinction pressures also left their mark. Large mainland predators never established stable populations on the island, likely because the ecosystem could not sustain the enormous prey biomass required by multi-ton carnivores. That absence created vacant ecological space, and evolution responded accordingly. Hatzegopteryx expanded into the apex predator role not because pterosaurs were inherently destined for dominance, but because the island lacked the competitors that normally prevented such an expansion elsewhere. Foster's rule, often called the island rule, complements the Wilson and MacArthur framework by describing what happens not to species numbers, but to body size itself. Large animals tend to shrink under resource limitation, while smaller species sometimes expand into ecological roles unavailable on the mainland. Hatzeg remains the oldest and most complete fossil demonstration of this process, operating simultaneously across multiple dinosaur lineages within a single ecosystem. What later scientists expressed mathematically, Franz Nopcsa had sensed intuitively decades earlier. When he proposed in 1914 that the island's dinosaurs were genuine dwarfs rather than juveniles, he was recognizing something far larger than unusual bones. He understood that islands were not miniature continents, they obeyed different biological rules. Isolation itself acted as an evolutionary force, reorganizing ecosystems from the ground upward. Today, those ideas extend far beyond paleontology. Modern conservation biology relies heavily on island biogeography theory because fragmented habitats often behave like ecological islands separated by cities, farmland, or roads. Wildlife corridors, protected reserves, and rewilding projects all depend on understanding how isolation alters extinction, risk, and species movement over time. The vanished island beneath present-day Romania therefore continues influencing living ecosystems. Its dinosaurs became part of a broader scientific language describing how geography quietly shapes the destiny of life itself. For tens of millions of years, Hatzeg changed slowly. Rivers shifted course through the floodplains. Forest margins advanced and retreated with the seasons. New species arrived across the European archipelago, while older lineages disappeared quietly into extinction. Evolution moved at its usual patient pace, reshaping bodies over immense spans of time, while the island continued drifting through the warm waters of the Tethys Sea. Then, 66 million years ago, change arrived from beyond the Earth. The object itself measured roughly 10 kilometers across, traveling at approximately 20 kilometers per second through space before striking the planet near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The collision released more energy than any volcanic eruption or earthquake in recorded human history. Rock beneath the impact site vaporized instantly. Material blasted upward through the atmosphere and beyond it, carrying pulverized debris high above the planet before gravity slowly pulled it back downward again. The first moments unfolded with impossible violence. A fireball expanded outward from the impact zone, visible across enormous distances. Ejected material returning through the atmosphere heated to incandescence, turning the sky itself into a source of thermal radiation. Across large portions of the northern hemisphere, forests and dry vegetation ignited almost simultaneously. Shockwaves propagated through the Earth's crust. Coastlines around connected oceans experienced mega tsunamis powerful enough to rearrange entire marine environments within hours. Yet the longer catastrophe proved even more destructive than the initial collision. The asteroid struck sulfur-rich rock formations, forcing immense quantities of sulfur compounds and dust into the upper atmosphere. Sunlight weakened as aerosols spread globally. Temperatures fell rapidly within weeks. Photosynthesis began collapsing across terrestrial and marine ecosystems alike. Plants died back first. Herbivores followed. Predators endured briefly before starvation spread upward through every remaining food chain. Distance offered no protection. Hatzeg lay thousands of kilometers from the impact site, isolated within the Tethys Sea and separated from North America by entire oceans. But planetary systems do not recognize geographic boundaries. The island's forests darkened beneath the same obscured skies, affecting the rest of the world. Seasonal rhythms failed. Vegetation growth slowed or ceased entirely. Rivers continued moving through the floodplains, but the ecosystems surrounding them had begun unraveling. The moment still survives physically within the rocks. Around the world, geologists identify the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods through a thin layer of iridium-rich clay deposited at the time of impact. Iridium is uncommon within Earth's crust, but abundant in many asteroids, making the layer a planetary signature of extraterrestrial collision. That same boundary exists in the sediments of the Hatzeg Basin, a narrow gray band separating two fundamentally different worlds. Below it lie the remains of Hatzegopteryx, Balar, Magyarosaurus, Zalmoxes, and the subtropical island ecosystem that sustained them. Above it, silence. Approximately 75% of all species on Earth disappeared during the extinction event. Every non-avian dinosaur vanished. Every pterosaur disappeared with them. Large marine reptiles, ammonites, and countless other lineages ended within a geologically brief interval. Animals above roughly 25 kilograms faced particularly severe survival pressures because larger bodies required stable food supplies that no longer existed. On Hatzeg, the floodplains emptied. The dwarf sauropods stopped moving through the fern clearings. The giant pterosaurs no longer crossed the island's sky. The strange evolutionary experiment that isolation had shaped over millions of years ended almost all at once, leaving only buried traces beneath the sediment where the rivers continued flowing long after the ecosystem itself was gone. After the darkness settled over the world, survival no longer depended on strength. For millions of years, the great animals of Hatzeg had dominated the island through scale, speed, and constant appetite. The dwarf titanosaurs crossed the floodplains in herds. Hatzegopteryx scanned the forests from above and from the ground. Baylor moved through the undergrowth with compact muscular precision. Then, within a span of time so short it barely registers in geology, those lineages disappeared from the earth entirely. What remained behind were the smaller bodies hidden beneath them. Among fallen vegetation and ash-darkened wetlands, lizards continued threading through cracks in the sediment. Frogs survived in muddy pools replenished by seasonal rain. Snakes hunted quietly through debris where insects and small vertebrates still persisted. Turtles withdrew into river systems and stagnant channels. Crocodilians endured near the water margins, their slow metabolisms allowing them to survive long stretches with little food. The same biological restraint that had once insulated them from the pressures of island dwarfism now insulated them from extinction itself. And above all of them, birds survived. They were the final surviving dinosaurs, though nothing about them resembled the vanished rulers that had dominated the Mesozoic world. Survival favored compact bodies, flexible diets, rapid reproduction, and low energy demands. Birds possessed all of these. Many could feed on seeds scattered across the devastated landscape, one of the few reliable food sources left after photosynthesis collapsed during the impact winter. Seeds could remain dormant for long periods, waiting beneath dead vegetation and sediment while larger food webs failed around them. The mammals that endured shared similar advantages. For more than 150 million years, they had lived mostly in shadow, small, nocturnal, or crepuscular creatures, occupying ecological margins beneath reptilian giants. They fed opportunistically, sheltered underground, reproduced quickly, and required comparatively little food. The catastrophe that erased the dominant animals of the Cretaceous suddenly rewarded the exact traits that had once limited mammals to obscurity. The island itself also began to change. As the Paleogene world emerged from the extinction, climates gradually cooled and sea levels shifted. The warm waters of the Tethys Sea slowly retreated from parts of Europe. Islands that had once remained isolated for millions of years began merging into larger landmasses. The European archipelago fragmented, connected, and reshaped itself across immense spans of time. By the Eocene, recognizable continental regions were beginning to form from what had once been scattered tropical islands. The land that had carried Hatzeg's strange ecosystem through the late Cretaceous eventually became part of the Carpathian Basin. Tectonic compression associated with the rise of the Alps folded and tilted the ancient sediments. The same geological violence that reshaped Europe also sealed many of the fossils deep within the earth, preserving them through tens of millions of years of erosion and uplift. The world that followed belonged to the survivors. Mammals spread outward into ecological roles. The dinosaurs no longer occupied. Birds inherited skies once crossed by giant pterosaurs. Forests regrew under new conditions, filled with unfamiliar sounds and unfamiliar bodies. The age of Hatzegopteryx ended completely. No giant flying reptile would ever dominate the skies again. Long after the island itself vanished beneath shifting continents, people still walked its bones without realizing what rested beneath their feet. The hills and valleys of the Hatzeg Basin continued weathering through rain, frost, and slow tectonic uplift. Rivers cut through ancient sediment. Cliffs exposed buried layers that had once formed floodplains beside the Tethys Sea. Fossils emerged gradually from the rock, sometimes uncovered by erosion before scientists ever reached them. Even after Franz Nopcsa's death in 1933, excavation work never disappeared completely. Romanian paleontologists continued collecting and cataloging material through the middle decades of the 20th century, preserving the continuity of research during years when much of Europe was consumed by war, political upheaval, and economic hardship. Yet for decades, Hatzeg remained scientifically isolated in another sense. The fossils existed, but many of the tools required to fully understand them did not. Nopcsa had proposed extraordinary ideas about island dwarfism, behavior, and evolutionary pressure using little more than comparative anatomy and intuition. Modern paleontology eventually developed the technologies needed to test those ideas directly. By the 1990s, several independent fields had matured enough to reopen the questions Hatzeg had been asking for almost a century. Bone histology allowed researchers to determine growth stages from microscopic tissue structure. Island biogeography provided mathematical frameworks for understanding isolated ecosystems. Biomechanics made it possible to model movement, feeding behavior, and structural stress in extinct animals with increasing precision. The island returned to scientific focus almost all at once. In 2002, Hatzegopteryx was formally described, revealing the existence of a giant Ajdarchid unlike any previously known. In 2009, geologist Matthias Vermeer discovered the remarkably complete remains of Belauer Bondoc in the Seebesch Formation, with the formal description following in 2010. That same year, the histological work led by Cohenstein confirmed definitively that Magurosaurus adults were truly dwarfed, validating Nopcsa's central argument after nearly a century of debate. In 2017, the neck biomechanics study by Darren Naish and Mark Whitten demonstrated just how structurally unusual Hatzegopteryx had been, supporting the idea of a powerful terrestrial predator rather than a delicate probing flyer. The discoveries continued into the 2020s. New titanosaur species, including Petrostatin and Uriash, expanded the picture of how many separate sauropod lineages had independently undergone dwarfism on the island. Each new specimen refined growth estimates, ecological relationships, and migration histories across the ancient European archipelago. Recognition followed as well. In 2015, the Hatzeg region received UNESCO Global Geopark designation, formally acknowledging its international scientific significance. The designation brought excavation funding, legal protection, educational infrastructure, and long-term conservation planning. Modern digs now recover not only bones, but pollen grains, spores, fossil wood, and sediment chemistry that together reconstruct the island's environment with increasing detail. There is a quiet geological symmetry in all of this. The tectonic compression that eventually destroyed Hatzeg Island also preserved it. Continental collision folded the sediments, buried the fossils deeply enough to protect them, then later lifted portions of those rocks back toward the surface through erosion and mountain building. The island disappeared physically while remaining intact inside the stone beneath modern Romania, waiting for science to catch up with the questions it had been holding for 70 million years. The island vanished, but the pattern did not. Again and again across Earth's history, isolated landmasses repeated the same strange transformations that once unfolded on Hatzeg. Different oceans, different climates, different species, yet the outcomes bent along familiar lines as though evolution were following instructions written deep into the mathematics of survival itself. Hatzeg remains the oldest and most complete example preserved in the fossil record, but it was never unique in principle. Far to the southeast, on Flores Island in Indonesia, another isolated world produced one of the most unsettling examples of island evolution ever discovered. Homo floresiensis, formally described in 2004, stood only about 1.1 meters tall as an adult. The species descended from larger human ancestors that became trapped on the island for hundreds of thousands of years. Over time, limited food and geographic isolation steadily favored smaller bodies. Stone tools, butchered animal remains, and skeletal anatomy all suggest a fully adapted human species, reduced to a scale that once seemed impossible for our own lineage. The same island also hosted dwarf elephants. The pattern repeated itself so precisely that it seemed almost geological in its inevitability. Across the Mediterranean during the Pleistocene, Malta and Sicily developed ecosystems that would have felt strangely familiar beside ancient Hatzeg. Paleoloxodon falconeri, one of the most extreme dwarf elephants ever known, stood only about 90 centimeters tall at the shoulder. Around these miniature elephants lived giant swans, oversized dormouse, and unusually large reptiles. Small animals expanded into ecological opportunities, left vacant by isolation, while larger animals steadily contracted under the burden of limited resources. Dwarfism and gigantism unfolded simultaneously within the same confined landscapes, just as they once had in the European archipelago of the Late Cretaceous. New Zealand produced another variation of the same experiment. Without mammalian predators, birds expanded into roles that elsewhere belonged to carnivorous mammals or large theropods. The moa became enormous, browsing herbivores spread across forests and grasslands, some species exceeding 3 meters in height. In response, Haast's eagle underwent rapid gigantism. Within less than 2 million years, it evolved into the largest eagle known to science, powerful enough to attack prey weighing more than 15 times its own body mass. The resemblance to Hatzegopteryx is difficult to ignore. In both ecosystems, aerial predators expanded downward into terrestrial apex roles because those niches stood empty. Madagascar tells the same story again in another language of bones. Elephant birds towered above the island's forests. Giant lemurs occupied ecological spaces absent elsewhere. Strange mammals like Plesiorycteropus evolved in prolonged isolation, shaped by pressures unique to the island, yet recognizable in principle, beside Hatzeg, Flores, or New Zealand. What connects all these places is not coincidence. Whenever a landmass becomes isolated, immigration slows, resources narrow, and ecological vacancies emerge. Large bodies become expensive. Small bodies gain opportunity. Predators evolve from whatever lineage happens to arrive first. Over immense spans of time, evolution repeatedly converges towards similar structural solutions because physics, metabolism, and ecology restrict the number of viable paths available. The names change, the continents drift. Millions of years separate one island from another. Yet the underlying story remains remarkably constant, as though the planet keeps rerunning the same quiet experiment with different animals each time. On isolated islands scattered across the modern world, evolution is still quietly repeating patterns, first written deep in the age of dinosaurs. The process has not stopped. It simply moves too slowly for most human lives to notice, without careful measurement. Along the coast of California, the Channel Islands hold one of the clearest living examples. The Channel Island fox, descended from mainland gray foxes that reached the islands thousands of years ago, they became steadily smaller generation after generation until adults were roughly 30% lighter than their continental relatives. Scientists estimate the transformation occurred within the last 7,000 to 9,000 years, almost instantaneous on geological timescales. Smaller bodies required less food, matured quickly, and survived more efficiently on islands where resources fluctuated seasonally. The same biological pressures that once reshaped dwarf titanosaurs on Hatzeg were now acting on modern carnivores beneath oak trees and coastal scrub. Far out in the Atlantic Ocean, another isolated population continued changing in measurable ways. The sow sheep of St. Kilda, separated from mainland populations since the Bronze Age, remain noticeably smaller than the domestic sheep from which they descended. Long-term studies conducted during the 1990s and 2000s documented something even more striking. The animals were continuing to shrink in real time. Warmer winters reduced the advantage of large body size, while smaller individuals survived harsh seasons more efficiently and reproduced earlier. Evolution here was not preserved in fossils or inferred from ancient bones. It was unfolding within the span of scientific observation, visible across living generations, grazing beneath cold sea cliffs. Elsewhere, isolation produced the opposite result. On a handful of Indonesian islands, Komodo dragons became the largest lizards alive on Earth. Their ancestors were smaller monitor lizards, but island ecosystems lacking large mammalian predators opened an ecological vacancy that favored increasing size. Over immense stretches of time, these reptiles expanded into apex predator roles normally occupied by far larger carnivores. The pattern mirrors what occurred on Hatzeg, where a flying reptile gradually inherited the role abandoned by giant theropod dinosaurs. Again and again, isolated ecosystems redirect evolution toward whatever form can occupy the empty space most efficiently. The modern implications reach far beyond remote islands. Human development now divides forests, wetlands, and grasslands into disconnected habitat fragments separated by highways, cities, and industrial land. To wildlife populations trapped inside them, these fragmented regions function as ecological islands, surrounded not by water but by terrain too dangerous to cross safely. Gene flow weakens, resources become constrained, selection pressures intensify. Across multiple continents, researchers are beginning to document shifts in body size, metabolism, and behavior among animals, adapting to fragmented landscapes created within only decades. Hatzeg, therefore, belongs to more than the distant past. Its fossils describe biological rules that remain active now, shaping living populations under the same pressures of confinement and isolation. The island vanished tens of millions of years ago, yet the experiment it revealed continues quietly across the modern Earth. Wherever life becomes separated from the wider world and forced to adapt within shrinking boundaries, long after the animals of Hatzeg vanished, the island continued speaking through the patterns hidden inside its fossils. Not merely patterns of bone or anatomy, but patterns of behavior in evolution itself, repeated so consistently across time that they begin to resemble something deeper than coincidence. Evolution is often described as blind and directionless. No plans, no goals, no preferred destination. Random mutation filtered only by survival and reproduction. In one sense, this remains true. Nothing on Hatzeg evolved because it intended to become smaller, stranger, or more specialized. No dwarf sauropod understood the island shrinking around it. No pterosaur consciously stepped into the ecological role abandoned by giant theropods. And yet, the outcomes themselves display a remarkable consistency. Again and again, isolated islands push large herbivores towards smaller bodies. Again and again, vacant predator niches become occupied by whatever lineage remains capable of exploiting them. Again and again, unrelated animals, facing similar pressures, converge towards strikingly similar solutions. Hatzeg did not produce these results uniquely. Malta produced dwarf elephants. New Zealand produced giant predatory birds. Flores produced diminutive humans. Different epochs, different continents, different starting materials, yet the same ecological forces repeatedly sculpted life into recognizable forms. The randomness exists in the actors, the structure exists in the system. This is the quiet implication hidden beneath the fossil beds of Hatzeg. Evolution may lack intention, but it possesses something resembling logic, not foresight or design, but algorithmic consistency. Certain environmental pressures reliably constrain living systems toward a limited range of viable outcomes. Large animals on small islands become energetically expensive. Apex predator niche cannot remain empty indefinitely. Herbivores adapt to restricted vegetation. Populations isolated from mainland competition begin reorganizing around efficiency rather than scale. Given similar conditions, life repeatedly arrives at similar answers. The deeper consequence of this idea unsettles the way evolution is often imagined. If the process is this constrained by ecology and physics, then perhaps much of the living world is less accidental than it first appears. The species themselves may be contingent, products of countless unpredictable events stretching back through deep time. But the ecological roles they occupy seem almost inevitable. If one lineage disappears, another eventually drifts into the vacancy. If one predator vanishes, something else learns to hunt. If one herbivore collapses under scarcity, a smaller form emerges capable of surviving where the larger body could not. Hatzeg demonstrates this with unusual clarity because the island functioned as a sealed system. Its boundaries limited possibility while exposing the underlying mechanics more clearly than a continent ever could. Within those limits, life reorganized itself with patient precision. That may be the most profound thing the island reveals. Beneath the apparent chaos of extinction, mutation, migration, and survival, evolution repeatedly constructs stable ecological architectures from whatever materials happen to remain available. The names and shapes change across the ages, but the structure underneath persists, rebuilding itself over and over, as though life is continually solving the same ancient problems with different pieces. Nothing remains of Hatzeg Island itself, no shoreline, no forests of cycads or conifers, no floodplains carrying the footprints of dwarf sauropods across wet sediment. The island vanished so completely that even the sea surrounding it disappeared afterward. The Tethys Ocean that once separated Europe into scattered tropical islands no longer exists in any recognizable form. Over tens of millions of years, tectonic plates drifted together with immense, patient force. The seafloor compressed upward into mountain chains stretching across continents. Portions of that vanished ocean now survive as stone within the Alps, the Zagros Mountains, and the Himalayas. Landscapes that once lay beneath warm, shallow seas became folded into peaks capped with snow and ice. Yet fragments of the old island endured beneath the pressure. What survives today is sediment, river silts, floodplain muds, layers of compressed earth deposited gradually through wet seasons and dry seasons long before human beings existed. These sediments hardened into rock within the Hațeg basin of modern Romania, tilted upward and exposed across hillsides by erosion and geological uplift. The island disappeared, but the ground beneath it became an archive. Inside those rocks rest the fossils themselves. Not bone in the ordinary sense, not living tissue preserved intact across 70 million years. The original calcium phosphate structures slowly dissolved underground while mineral-rich groundwater seeped through the sediment. Silica, calcite, and iron compounds replaced the microscopic spaces once occupied by living cells. Molecule by molecule, the original substance vanished while the shape endured. A fossil therefore preserves form more faithfully than material. The structure remains. The living animal does not. What emerges from the stone is something stranger than survival. A Magurosaurus femur displayed in a museum is not truly a dinosaur bone in the ordinary sense. It is the mineral memory of a bone that belonged to an animal that walked across an island that no longer exists, inside an ocean erased from the earth during the final chapter of the Cretaceous world. The distance between that vanished ecosystem and the present moment becomes almost impossible to grasp directly. Modern Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Agriculture began around 10,000 years ago. The Roman Empire collapsed approximately 1600 years ago. Entire human civilizations rise and disappear within intervals that barely register against the chronology separating the present from Hatzeg Island. By the time the earliest humans appeared, the island had already been gone for nearly the entire history of mammals as dominant land animals. And yet the fossils remained stubbornly specific. The bones contain growth rings recording seasons of scarcity and abundance. Neck vertebrae preserve the immense structural reinforcement that allowed Hatzegopteryx to restrain struggling prey. Limb proportions reveal which animals walked slowly, which moved lightly, which carried armor, which depended on speed. Individual species names emerge from the silence with surprising precision, as though fragments of the lost ecosystem continue resisting complete erasure. That persistence may be the quiet miracle of paleontology. Entire worlds vanish beyond recovery, oceans close, mountains rise, climates transform, and ecosystems collapse into extinction. Still, buried beneath layers of stone, tiny anatomical details remain waiting in darkness, carrying enough information for distant descendants to reconstruct the outline of a vanished island and the strange lives that once moved across it. In the end, the strange island, hidden inside the rocks of Romania, was not revealed first by advanced instruments or international research teams. It was revealed by a young man standing in a remote valley, holding bones that did not make sense. Franz Nopcsa was only 20 years old in 1897 when his sister Ilona discovered fossils near the family estate at Sicel. He had no formal training in paleontology at the time, no modern evolutionary framework, no established theory explaining why giant dinosaurs might become small. Yet somewhere between the fractured vertebrae and compressed limb bones, he understood that the landscape preserved in the rock record did not belong to an ordinary continent. The dinosaurs were too small, not juveniles, not deformed individuals, not isolated abnormalities, but entire species reshaped by conditions unique to a vanished island ecosystem. Nopcsa realized that the bones represented the remains of an isolated, evolutionary world, separated from the mainland for immense spans of time. He inferred the existence of an ancient island before plate tectonics explained how Europe had once fragmented into archipelagos. He inferred island dwarfism decades before island biogeography existed as a scientific discipline. He reached the correct conclusion using little more than comparative anatomy, field observations, and an unusual willingness to trust what the fossils themselves implied. The scientific community resisted him for years. That resistance now feels predictable in hindsight. Science advances through evidence, but it also protects established frameworks. At the beginning of the 20th century, giant dinosaurs becoming miniature island forms sounded implausible, almost fantastical. Many researchers assumed the fossils belonged to juveniles because the alternative required accepting that evolution could systematically remodel body size on isolated landmasses. The idea arrived before the intellectual structure capable of supporting it had fully formed. Nopcsa, therefore, occupied an uncomfortable position common to many scientific pioneers. He was not wrong, he was early. The tools required to settle the debate definitively simply did not exist during his lifetime. Bone histology, the microscopic study of growth rings preserved inside fossil tissue, remained undeveloped for decades afterward. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did paleontologists gain the ability to slice fossil bones thin enough to examine growth patterns directly. When researchers finally applied those techniques to Magurosaurus in 2010, the results confirmed that the animals were fully mature adults despite their small size. By then, Nopcsa had been dead for nearly 80 years. He never saw the studies validating his conclusions, never read the papers confirming that Hatzeg had truly been an island ecosystem shaped by dwarfism and ecological isolation exactly as he proposed. The vindication arrived long after the man himself disappeared into history. Today, the Nopcsa family castle stands partly in ruins, staircases collapsed, stone walls weathered by time and neglect. Yet the fossils discovered there endure in museums and research collections across Europe. Students learned species names connected to his work. Scientific papers continue refining ideas he first recognized from fragments of bone in mountain sediment. The island vanished. The sea vanished. Even the man who understood them vanished. But the pattern he saw hidden inside the fossils remained true. Mist settles differently across the valleys of Transylvania in the early morning. It drifts low through meadows, curls around ruined stone walls, and gathers beneath the dark forests climbing the Carpathian slopes. Long before the region became associated with fictional castles and immortal aristocrats, the land itself had already been shaped by something far older, stranger, and infinitely more real. To most of the outside world, Transylvania exists as the home of Dracula. Bram Stoker's novel appeared in 1897, filling the mountains of Romania with shadows, wolves, abandoned corridors, and the image of a predator waiting somewhere beyond the reach of firelight. The timing now feels almost impossible to separate from coincidence. In that same year, while Europe became fascinated with an imaginary monster rising from the Carpathians, Franz Nopcsa began describing fossils from the Hatzeg Basin that hinted at another kind of creature entirely. Not undead, not supernatural, a reptile with a wingspan of roughly 10 meters, a skull longer than many adult humans are tall, and a body adapted not merely for flight, but for walking the ground as an apex predator. Its discoverers would eventually give it a name that translated loosely into monster of terror. Unlike the vampire of fiction, this animal had truly moved through the forests and floodplains of ancient Transylvania. It had breathed real air beneath a subtropical sky 70 million years before the first human story was ever told. The parallel lingers because both legends emerge from the same terrain. The Carpathian Basin has always carried a sense of remoteness. Valleys enclosed by mountains, villages isolated by forests and weather, stone ruins half reclaimed by vegetation. But the deeper strangeness of Transylvania was never hidden in folklore alone. It was hidden beneath the hills themselves, inside tilted layers of sediment deposited when the region lay scattered across tropical islands in the Tethys Sea. The mountains that later inspired stories of vampires were created by tectonic collision, continental crust folding upward over millions of years as Africa pressed slowly into Europe. That same compression lifted the ancient floodplain sediments of Hatzeg toward the surface. Rivers and erosion then carved through the rock, exposing the buried remains of the island ecosystem layer by layer. The landscape visible today appears calm. Meadows spread beneath church towers and farmhouses. Sheep graze along quiet slopes. Roads wind through forests of beech and pine. Travelers pass through the Hatzeg region without realizing that beneath the grass lies a vanished world preserved in fragments of mineralized bone. A femur from a dwarf sauropod, the neck vertebra of a giant azdarchid, the curved claw of Balar. The fossils remain where the island once stood, though the island itself disappeared long ago. Perhaps that is why the story of Hatzeg feels inseparable from Transylvania. Both exist in layers, one shaped by myth, the other by geology. One carried forward through novels and folklore, the other through stone and fossil tissue. Yet both emerged from the same mountains, the same valleys, the same ancient ground where strange things once walked slowly through the mist. There are moments in geology when the earth begins to feel less like a place and more like an archive. A hillside erodes, a layer of mudstone fractures open. Inside it rests the outline of a femur from an animal no human being could ever have imagined without the fossil itself. Not merely extinct, but belonging to a world whose climate, coastlines, forests, and food chains no longer exist anywhere on the planet. Hatzeg was one of those worlds. For approximately 30 million years, the island persisted in quiet isolation within the Tethys Sea. Rivers crossed its floodplains. Ferns spread beneath cycads and conifers. Small titanosaurs moved through the undergrowth at eye level. Balar stepped between shadows with its compact, muscular frame. Hatzegopteryx scanned clearings from above the canopy or walked slowly across open ground on folded wings, carrying a skull built not for scavenging, but for domination. Generation after generation lived entire lives there. Eggs hatched, bones healed after injury. Young animals learned migration paths through the island forests. Predators failed hunts and tried again. Dry seasons came and passed. Storms flooded riverbanks and buried carcasses beneath layers of sediment that would one day harden into stone. None of it was temporary to the animals inside it. To them, Hatzeg was not a strange, lost world. It was simply the world. Then it ended. Not gradually enough for adaptation to keep pace, and not gently enough for continuity to survive. The dwarf titanosaurs vanished. Balar vanished. Hatzegopteryx vanished. The island itself disappeared beneath tectonic collision, sea level change, and the immense rearrangement of continents. No living descendant preserves the shape of that ecosystem. No surviving lineage carries forward its structure intact. And yet the world existed in full complexity for longer than human civilization has existed by a factor almost too large to visualize. When Franz Nopcsa first examined those fossils in the 19th century, he was not simply identifying extinct species. He was looking into the remains of an entire vanished system of life that had once functioned with complete ecological coherence. Forests, predators, scavengers, rivers, nesting grounds, drought cycles, reproductive behavior, territorial movement, all of it once operating continuously on an island that no map would ever show again. The fossil record suggests this has happened endlessly. The Cambrian seas filled with body plans unlike anything alive today. The coal forests of the Carboniferous spread beneath giant insects and amphibians. Permian reefs flourished before collapsing almost completely. Entire marine ecosystems ruled the Cretaceous oceans before vanishing into stone. Each world appeared permanent from within itself. Each one disappeared. Hatzeg is unsettling, partly because it compresses that truth into something visible and specific. A single island, a single predator, a single dwarf sauropod lineage. Enough detail to understand that these vanished worlds were not vague evolutionary stages leading inevitably toward the present. They were complete realities in their own right. The Earth has always been constructing worlds with immense precision, allowing them to endure for millions of years, and then erasing them so thoroughly that only mineral traces remain beneath the grass. High in the hills of western Romania, beyond the roads that wind through farms and forests, there are slopes where layers of gray and brown sediment emerge quietly through the grass. At first glance, they appear ordinary, no different from exposed stone anywhere else in the Carpathian Basin. Rain darkens them in winter. Summer heat cracks them apart grain by grain. Moss gathers in the shallow fractures. Sheep pass over them without pause. But those rocks were once mud, not metaphorically, but literally. Fine sediment settling through slow floodwater on a subtropical plain 70 million years ago. Rivers carried silt from uplands thick with conifers and cycads, spreading it across the lowlands season after season. Floods buried fallen branches, spores, footprints, eggshell fragments, and bones beneath fresh layers of mineral-rich sediment. Then the water withdrew, leaving another thin film of earth behind. Over immense spans of time, the layers deepened, compressed, hardened, and became stone. Somewhere inside those rocks there is still a bone waiting, perhaps part of a Magyarosaurus rib, narrow and compact from a lineage shaped by scarcity. Perhaps the claw of Balor, curved and sharp beneath its coating of mineral deposits. Perhaps a fragment from the skull of Hatzegopteryx itself, once attached to jaws large enough to seize struggling prey from the fern-covered ground. The exact identity does not matter as much as the silence surrounding it. The bone has remained there through spans of time so enormous that human history disappears inside them almost instantly. It was already buried before the Atlantic Ocean reached its modern form, before the Alps rose from tectonic collision, before grasslands spread across continents, before primates climbed through ancient forests, before language, cities, memory, or names. All that time, the fossil remained in darkness. Yet the rock enclosing it has never stopped moving. Frost widens microscopic cracks during winter nights. Rainwater seeps through sediment and loosens grains one by one. Hillsides erode by millimeters across centuries. The earth slowly lifts old seabeds upward and wears mountains back down again. Geological time appears motionless only because human lives are too brief to watch it properly. And eventually, after 66 million years, the bone approaches the surface. Not dramatically, not through explosion or revelation, only through patience. A corner emerges from the stone after heavy rain. Sunlight touches mineral that has not seen open air since the late Cretaceous. Someone walking across the hillside notices a shape interrupting the texture of the rock, a curve too symmetrical to be accidental. A structure recognizably biological, despite the unimaginable distance separating observer and animal. In that instant, two worlds meet. A living mind stands in a landscape of forests, villages, and mountain roads, holding the remains of an ecosystem erased before mammals had become dominant on Earth. The island is gone. The rivers are gone. The predators and dwarf sauropods are gone. but the bone carried their existence through deep time anyway, preserving enough detail for the lost world to emerge once more inside human imagination. Hatzeg disappeared millions of years ago. The rocks did not forget. And now, neither will we.